And behold, they were all bound, and I saw, and they stood before him. And the judgment was held first over the stars. And they were judged and found guilty, and went to a place of condemnation, and they were cast into an abyss, full of fire and flaming, full of pillars of fire. And those 70 shepherds were judged and found guilty, and they were cast into that fiery abyss. Greetings, friends. Welcome back to the broadcast. I'm Sean, your host. Today we are resuming our study in the ancient book of Enoch. And we're going to be finishing chapter 89, starting with verse 55, which is where we left off last time. And then also reading all of chapter 90. Now, if you remember, chapter 89 was dealing with basically like a prophetic history of what would happen to the land, or to Israel. And we're seeing as we move forward in starting with verse 55, basically it looks like it's talking about some of the captivity and things of that nature that would happen to Israel in the future. Again, Enoch is seeing this in a vision. And then chapter 90, it's also very, very symbolic, but it seems to be dealing with those who would shepherd over God's people, the leaders of God's people, and how that would go down in history, ending with Messiah being the ruler, is the way it appears. But again, it's very, very symbolic, and you'll see that as we get into it. It also, chapter 90 also deals again with the very first angel who fell of the 200 that came down, probably talking about Azazel being judged, which is also interesting. And again, it refers to the angels as a star, and we've talked about that before, how in biblical apocryphal literature, stars almost always represent angelic beings. So that's kind of setting the stage here. And real quick, it is December 31st. It's the last day of 2019. If you've considered supporting this podcast but haven't gotten around to it, today would be a great day to do that for year end. So I'd really, really appreciate that. And I really, really appreciate all of you who have supported this podcast and helped make this happen for 2019. And I just hope and pray that God will provide and allow it to continue and to grow and to continue to be a blessing to others in the year 2020. And it's also a blessing to me and a privilege for me to get to study these documents and manuscripts and Bibles and to be able to share that with thousands and thousands of you around the world. So again, I'm blessed. I appreciate it. And if you've been blessed and by this work and you'd like to support it, you can go to scriptureandprophecy.com. All the links are there, or all the links are in the description below if you're listening on YouTube. All right, let's get started here. Remember, we're resuming chapter 89, starting where we left off the last time. So we'll be starting with verse 55, which looks like it's talking about Israel being given over to pagan nations. And then we'll read all of chapter 90. So let's begin. Chapter 89, verse 55. And he gave them over into the hands of the lions and tigers and wolves and hyenas, and into the hands of foxes, and to all the wild beasts. And those wild beasts began to tear in pieces those sheep. And I saw that he forsook their house and their tower, and gave them all into the hand of the lions to tear and devour them, into the hand of all the wild beasts. And I began to cry aloud with all my power, and to appeal to the Lord of the sheep, and to represent to him in regard to the sheep that they were devoured by all the wild beasts. But he remained unmoved, though he saw it, and rejoiced that they be devoured, and swallowed and robbed, and left them to be devoured in the hand of all the beasts. And he called 70 shepherds, and cast those sheep to them, that they might pasture them. And he spake to the shepherds and their companions, Let each individual of you pasture the sheep henceforward, and everything that I shall command you, that ye do. And I will deliver them over unto you duly numbered, and tell you which of them are to be destroyed, and them destroy ye. And he gave over unto them those sheep. Now, real quick, the book of Enoch is kind of describing that, God is the one who's really in control, right? This is part of judgment. It looks like it could be talking about the Babylonian captivity. They were handed over to be judged, and even though they were being devoured and all these terrible things were happening to them, it says that he saw it, but did nothing about it, and it appears it was part of their judgment. And then it seems like he's called forth these 70 shepherds, which, again, it's very symbolic. I've looked at some commentary and stuff. Ken Johnson, as an example, seems to think it's dealing with leaders, right? And the scriptures say that the heart of the king's heart is in God's hand, right? Something along those lines. And here it says that he is basically in control of these leaders, and he says, Let each individual of you pasture the sheep henceforward, and everything that I shall command you, that do ye. So let's continue, verse 60. And I will deliver them over unto you duly numbered, and tell you which of them are to be destroyed, and them destroy ye. And he gave over unto them those sheep. And he called another, and he spake unto him, Observe and mark everything that the shepherds will do to those sheep, for they will destroy more of them than I have commanded them. So he's having somebody keep record, according to verse 61. He's having somebody keep record of what the leaders who have been entrusted to do God's will, whether or not they do God's will, or whether or not they are excessive in what they do to God and to the sheep. Verse 62, And every excess and the destruction which will be wrought through the shepherds record, namely, how many they destroy according to my command, and how many according to their own caprice. Record against every individual shepherd, and all the destruction he effects. And read out before me by number how many they destroy, and how many they deliver over for destruction, that I may have this as a testimony against them, and know every deed of the shepherds, that I may comprehend and see what they do, whether or not they abide by my command which I have commanded them. But they shall not know it, and thou shalt not declare it to them, nor admonish them, but only record against each individual all the destruction which the shepherds effect, each in his time, and lay it all before me. We should also note, this also in some way could be talking about those who shepherd, as in lead flocks of God's people, and how God's keeping track. To scripture say, to whom much is given, much is required. Paul says that those who preach and pastor will be held to a higher standard. And so there's a great warning to those who would lead God's people, that the responsibility is high, and the stakes are high, and the judgment at the end is high. I'd be untruthful if I were to say that I wasn't concerned about that at times, being a human being, being flawed. And so I pray that God would always help me to walk that narrow path, and to lead people down that narrow path, and not lead them astray by mistake. Let's continue on, verse 65. And I saw till those shepherds pastured in their season, and they began to slay and to destroy more than they were bidden. And they delivered those sheep into the hand of the lions. And the lions and the tigers eat and devoured the greater part of those sheep, and the wild boars eat along with them, and they burnt the tower and demolished that house. And I became exceedingly sorrowful over the tower, because that house of the sheep was demolished, and afterwards I was unable to see if those sheep entered that house. Probably talking about the temple. Verse 68, and the shepherds and their associates delivered over those sheep and all the wild beasts to devour them. And each of them received in his time a definite number. It was written by the other in a book, how many each one of them destroyed of them. And each one slew and destroyed many more than was prescribed, and I began to weep and to lament on account of those sheep. And thus in the vision I saw the one who wrote. He wrote down every one that was destroyed by those shepherds day by day, and carried up and laid down and showed actually in the whole book to the Lord of the sheep, even everything that they had done, and all that each one of them had made away with, and all that they had given over to destruction. And the book was read before the Lord of the sheep. And he took the book from his hand, and he read it, and he sealed it, and laid it down. And forthwith I saw how the shepherds pastured for 12 hours. And behold, 3 of those sheep turned back, and came and entered, and began to build up all that had fallen down of that house. But the wild boars tried to hinder them, but they were not able. It's very likely that that's talking about the situation where Ezra came back, and Hananiah, and they began to rebuild, right? They began to rebuild the walls and rebuild the temple, but there was a lot of attacks and things on them while they were doing that. Let's continue, verse 73. And they began to build as before, and they reared up that tower, probably talking about the temple again. And it was named the High Tower, and they began again to place a table before the tower, but all the bread on it was polluted and not pure. And as touching all the eyes of those sheep were blinded, so that they saw not, and the eyes of their shepherds likewise, and they delivered them in large numbers to the shepherds for destruction. And they trampled the sheep with their feet and devoured them. And the Lord of the sheep remained unmoved till all the sheep were dispersed over the field and mingled with them. And they did not save them out of the hands of the beast. So here it looks like we have a dispersion of God's people, which we know took place all over the world. They were dispersed. Verse 76. And this one who wrote the book carried it up and showed it and read it before the Lord of the sheep, and implored him on their account and besought him on their account, as he showed him all the doings of the shepherds, and gave testimony before him against all the shepherds. And he took the actual book and laid it down beside him and departed. And so that wraps up chapter 89. And now let's see if we can get through chapter 90 here before we run out of time. Chapter 90, verse 1. And I saw, till that in this manner 35 shepherds undertook the pasturing of the sheep. And they severely completed their periods, as did the first, and the others received them into their hands, not to pasture them for their period, each shepherd in his own period. And after that I saw in my vision all the birds of heaven coming, the eagles, the vultures, the kites, the ravens. But the eagles led all the birds, and they began to devour those sheep, and to pick out their eyes, and to devour their flesh. And the sheep cried out, because their flesh was being devoured by the birds. And as for me, I looked and lamented in my sleep over that shepherd who pastured the sheep. And I saw until those sheep were devoured by the dogs, and eagles, and kites. And they left neither flesh nor skin, nor sinew remaining on them, till only their bones stood there, and their bones too fell to the earth, and the sheep became few. And I saw until the 23 had undertaken the pasturing, and completed in several periods 58 times. But behold, lambs were born by those white sheep, and they began to open their eyes, and to see, and to cry to the sheep. Yea, they cried to them, but they did not hearken to what they said to them, but were exceedingly deaf, and their eyes were very exceedingly blinded. Now, I was looking through Ken Johnson's commentary. seems to think we were getting into kind of like the Romans and when it's dealing with like the eagles and stuff. And then when it says, behold, lambs were born to those white sheep, seems to be talking about those who have trusted in Messiah, Christians. And they begin to cry and opened their eyes and to see and to cry to the sheep. And so telling the sheep, hey, look, here's the Savior, blah, blah. But then in verse 7, it says they cried to them, but they, meaning the sheep, did not hearken to what they said to them, but were exceedingly deaf, and their eyes were very exceedingly blinded. Verse 8, and I saw in the vision how the ravens flew upon those lambs and took one of those lambs and dashed the sheep in pieces and devoured them. And I saw horns grow up on those lambs, and the ravens cast down their horns. And I saw till there sprouted a great horn of one of those sheep, and their eyes were opened. And it looked at them, and their eyes opened, and it cried to the sheep, and the rams saw it and ran to it. And notwithstanding, all those eagles and vultures and ravens and kites still kept tearing the sheep and swooping down upon them and devouring them till the sheep remained silent. But the rams lamented and cried out. And those ravens fought and battled with it and sought to lay low its horn, but they had no power over it. Maybe it's possible that the rams here represent the Christians, the Gentile believers, right? Because they're not the same as the lambs, but they run to this other lamb who seems to be a leader, and even though they're being killed, they refuse to be silent about the truth. If you look at verse 11, it says, and notwithstanding, all those eagles and vultures and ravens and kites still kept tearing the sheep and swooping down upon them and devouring them, till the sheep remained silent, but the rams lamented and cried out. And those ravens fought the bat and battled with it, to sought to lay low its horn, but they had no power over it. And I saw till the shepherds and the eagles and the vultures and the kites came, and they cried to the ravens that they should break the horn of that ram, but they battled and fought with it, and battled with them, and cried, and its help might come. And I saw till that man, who wrote down the names of the shepherd and carried up into the presence of the Lord of the sheep, came and helped it, and it showed it everything. He had come down for the help of that ram. And I saw till the Lord of the sheep came unto them in wrath, and all who saw him fled, and they all fell into his shadow before his face. All the eagles and vultures and ravens and kites were gathered together, and there came with them all the sheep of the field, yea, all that came together helped each other to break that horn of the ram. And I saw that a man who wrote the book according to the command of the Lord, till he opened that book concerning the destruction which those 12 last shepherds had wrought, and showed that they devoured much more than their predecessors before the Lord of the sheep. Please note, it's possible that I've got things confused here and that the rams had nothing to do with believers. Again, when you're dealing with this apocalyptic symbolic literature, it takes a lot of study. It's very hard for us just to break it down in a 30-minute podcast and come up with all the answers. But you can go back and look over this and try to figure out what's going on here yourselves. Let's continue verse 18. And I saw till the Lord of the sheep came unto them, and took his hand and his staff and his wrath, and he smote the earth, and the earth clave asunder, and all the beasts and all the birds of the heaven fell from among those sheep, and were swallowed up in the earth, and it covered them. And I saw till a great sword was given to the sheep, and the sheep proceeded against all the beasts of the field to slay them, and all the beasts of the birds of heaven fled before their face. And I saw till a throne was erected in the pleasant land, and the Lord of the sheep sat himself thereon, and the others took and sealed the books and opened those books before the Lord of the sheep. See, it seems to be talking about now Messiah is here, along with New Jerusalem. And the Lord called those men, the 7 first white ones, and commanded that they should bring before him, beginning with the first star which led the way, all the stars who privy members were like those of horses, and they brought them all before him. So here we have the Lord, and he's commanded to be that the first star, meaning that angel who led the other angels astray, to come down and mate with the women, that he be brought before him for judgment. And he said to that man who wrote before him, being one of those 7 white ones, and he said unto him, Take those 70 shepherds, to whom I delivered the sheep, who taking them on their own authority slew more than I commanded them. So if we remember, the person who was, the angelic being who was responsible for writing all this down and keeping track of all those shepherds who would lead the lambs throughout history, that they be brought now they're being brought before the Lord to be judged because they slew more than they were supposed to. Verse 23, And behold, they were all bound, and I saw, and they all stood before him. And the judgment was held first over the stars, meaning angels. And they were judged and found guilty, and went to the place of condemnation, and they were cast into the abyss, full of fire, and flaming, and full of pillars of fire. And those 70 shepherds were judged and found guilty, and they were cast into the fiery abyss. And I saw at the time how like the abyss was opened in the midst of the earth, full of fire. And they brought those blinded sheep, and they were all judged and found guilty and cast into the fiery abyss, and they burned. Now this abyss was to the right of that house. And I saw those sheep burning, and their bones burning, and I stood up to see till they folded up that old house, and carried off the pillars, and all the beams and ornaments of the house were at the same time folded with it. And they carried it off and laid it in a place to the south of the land. And I saw till the Lord of the shepherd brought a new house, greater and loftier than the first, and set it up in the place of the first, which had been bare folded up. And its pillars were new, and its ornaments were new and larger than those of the first, the old one which he had taken away. And all the sheep were within it. And I saw all the sheep which had been left, all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds of heaven falling down and doing homage to those sheep, and making petition and obeying them in everything. And thereafter those 3 who were clothed in white had seized me by my hand, who had taken me up before, and the hand of that ram also seizing a hold of me, that they took me up and set me down in the midst of those sheep before the judgment took place. And those sheep were all white, and their wool was abundant and clean. And all that had been destroyed and dispersed, and all the beasts of the field, and all the birds of heaven assembled in that house. And the Lord of the sheep rejoiced with great joy, because they were all good, and had returned to his house. And I saw till they laid down that sword which had been given to the sheep, and they brought it back into the house, and it was sealed before the presence of the Lord. All the sheep were invited into that house, but it held them not. And the eyes of them were all open, and they saw the good, and there was not one among them that did not see. And I saw that the house was large and broad and very full. And I saw that white bull was born with large horns, and all the beasts of the field and all the birds of the air feared him, and made petition to him all the time. And I saw till their generations were transformed, and they all became white bulls, and that the first among them became a lamb, and that lamb became a great animal, and had great black horns on its head. And the Lord of the sheep rejoiced over it, and over all the oxen. And I slept in their midst, and I awoke and saw everything. This is the vision which I saw while I slept, and I awoke and blessed the Lord of righteousness, and gave him glory. Then I wept with a great weeping, and my tears stayed not till I could no longer endure it, when I saw they flowed on account of what I had seen, for everything shall come and be fulfilled. All the deeds of the men in their order were shown to me. On that night I remembered the first dream, and because of it I wept and was troubled, because I had seen the vision. And that is the end of chapter 90 in the ancient book of Enoch. Lots of symbolism. Looking back, I think I might have been wrong, trying to interpret the rams there on the fly. But in general, we can get an idea of what's taking place here. We can kind of see the history of Israel, and then the judgments, and all of that. Well, there you have it, my friends. I pray that you've been blessed this morning and encouraged this morning, and I just pray that this podcast continues to serve you and to be a blessing to all of you. And once more, I must say that it is my good privilege and my good pleasure to record this podcast for you. every week. That's all I have for you this morning. Lord willing, I'll be back at least one more time, but I'm hoping for 2 more times. We need to get our Torah portion in for the week, and I would love to get an end-time prophecy podcast in before the week ends. And so that's the goal. That's what's on the agenda. That's all I have for you this morning. Peace and grace be with all of you. And until next time, God bless.